what is happening with AI and water consumption. So we're gonna really get into it. This is gonna be longer, quite a bit longer than a 3-minute video. I've spent a decent amount of time digging into this, and it's just not really possible to get into all the nuance of this topic in a short video. And there's a lot of what I've seen happening is a lot of snippets of information kind of getting thrown around, and so I didn't want to put out another snippet of information. I kind of wanted to lead people through what we know and what we don't know on this topic. So a couple of big points that I'm going to hit, and I'm going to go into these things in some amount of depth here. But first of all, number one point is, right now we don't have great estimates about what the water consumption or the energy consumption of generative AI is, because the major companies that are pursuing these technologies are using closed source software. It's proprietary software, and they're not being very forthcoming about what they know, if they know what the cumulative impacts of this technology are on the energy grid and on water consumption. So another point here is, you may have seen some sort of estimate about the impact of individual queries to a what's called an AI chatbot, like ChatGPT, and that kind of individual footprint of generative AI is meant to indicate either that it's using a lot of water or not that much water. But the thing is, we don't have great estimates, kind of going back to that first point. And also, even if we did, that individual kind of footprint metric does not really give us a good overall sense of the cumulative impact of AI on water supplies. What we do know, we don't need to wait for really great estimates on these sorts of things. What we do know is that data centers are having significant impacts on certain communities right now already. And finally, the last point I want to hit is, this technology is growing. The demand for data centers, the demand for energy, and the demand for water, these things are growing very quickly. And so I think it's absolutely cause for concern, the rate of growth of these things, and I'm going to kind of get into this a little bit more, but we don't have really great reason to expect that we're going to achieve efficiencies of scale with this particular technology, generative AI. Okay, so on that first point here, the closed AI model providers, right? So Google, Microsoft, OpenAI, the closed AI model providers are serving up a total black box. We just don't have numbers. There's a range of energy consumption based on different parameters. So this article from May of 2025 in the MIT Technology Review, they find, in reality, the type and size of the model, the type of output you're generating, and countless variables beyond your control, like which energy grid is connected to the data center your request is sent to, and what time of day it's processed, can make one query thousands of times more energy intensive and emissions producing than another. Right? Thousands of times. That's a huge scale. It's a huge range of what the potential energy footprint of a chatbot query could be. And so, again, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to say, oh, this is the impact of every time you hit enter and when you're talking to a chatbot or whatever. But also more generally, it's just not really a good way to gauge the overall impact, because there's all sorts of variables on top of those variables. You know, how many people are using this technology? And again, I mean, what time of day? Where in the world are they using this technology? These things are very significant. These are really considerable factors here. Something else that I've seen, and so you've probably seen, you know, this estimate that 10 to 50 medium length chatbot queries consumes about 500 milliliters of water. Well, people then have taken that estimate, and that's from researchers. Comes from a journal. People have taken that estimate and compared that to other uses of technology, streaming services, video calls, you know, lots of technology that we use day to day, and that's a small amount compared to these other, you know, other more significant uses. To that, you know, I say, well, fair enough. Yeah, maybe we should be talking more about streaming services and these other uses of data centers that do use considerable amounts of energy. I'm going to kind of address that a little more in depth, but I want to point out that what I've seen is taking that chatbot usage, or that chatbot demand of energy or water, and use that as a stand-in for what we call AI, or generative AI. Well, there's more to AI than just the large language models. There's also image generation and video generation. Image generation, depending on the parameters, not that much more energy intensive than your text-based queries, which is a little bit counterintuitive. Again, lots of variables here. Video generation, however, does use a lot of energy. So again, remember that first point, we don't have great estimates here, but looking at open source models, which may or may not be in the ballpark of the closed source models, MIT Technology Review finds that generating a 5-second video uses the same amount of energy as riding 38 miles on an e-bike or running a microwave for over an hour, right? So if you're, you know, if millions of people are generating multiple 5-second videos every day, you can see how that's going to scale up very, very, very quickly. So we need to back up a little bit, because this is about water. That's what I am talking about. But I've kind of slipped into talking about energy consumption. So let's make explicit the connection there. Electricity generation, depending on how that's generated, consumes a lot of water. So thermoelectric power generation, which is very commonplace. That's a large part of our energy mix. It's burning fossil fuels such as coal or petroleum or natural gas to boil water and to turn a turbine. Nuclear energy is also thermoelectric. It's the same basic principle. It's not burning fossil fuels, but a nuclear fission reaction generates a lot of heat. You're boiling water, you're turning a turbine, and that creates electricity, right? So thermoelectric power in the US consumes about 3.7 million acre feet of water every year. That's a lot of water. So that depends, though, on you know, whether that's going to cause water stress or not. Really depends on where that is. So if you have coal power plants, like here in Utah, coal has been phasing out, but you know, we have coal power plants here in the American West. We don't have a lot of extra water that we can be boiling to create electricity. So when you boil water and it evaporates, That's about as true a loss of water as you can have, right? Additionally, you need water in these plants to cool equipment, and some percentage of that gets consumed in the sense that it evaporates. So if you're in a place where water is plentiful, right, where you can even, so in the east of the U.S., people have riparian rights to water, and so if your river is large enough, like the Mississippi, for instance, you can pull enough water off to boil and to cool your operation without diminishing the water source for downstream users, which makes it a-okay in terms of riparian law. In the West, a little bit different. You're going to have a water right to be able to consume that much water, and then that water is gone. It can't be used for any other purposes. When we're talking about data centers, which is how we get generative AI served to us at our personal computers or our phones. So when we're talking about data centers, they use a lot of electricity to power the processor, either a CPU or a graphics processor unit, which is more popular in these AI data centers, also known as hyperscale data centers, because you can get a lot more intensive computational power out of graphics processing units, such as the ones that NVIDIA makes. So you're powering the processors. You are also using a certain amount of water and energy to cool all those server racks. So you have to keep them under a certain temperature, or the equipment overheats and it breaks down. So water is commonly used to cool data centers. Some proportion of that water then gets evaporated in that process and it's lost. This is perhaps a minor point, but when we're talking about water, we are also potentially talking about pollution. And one thing that data centers do, so if you withdraw water, run it through the data center to cool the server racks, and then return it to the natural channels, now the water is at a higher temperature because all that heat energy has been absorbed into the water. Returning it back into a riparian environment can be a form of pollution, in the sense that that's going to alter the ecosystem. Perhaps a minor point, people here are really thinking about consumption. I just wanted to point that out. And then another use of water that's involved in the production of AI technology, that's involved in your data centers with the server racks, is you have to manufacture a lot of semiconductors. You have to manufacture a lot of processor units. That production process uses a fair amount of water, and it's water that has to be very purified, because it's a very sensitive fabrication process with very intricately designed silicon wafers. Anyway, the point that I went off on a whole tear, but the point is that energy consumption is linked to water consumption. There's a relationship there. And so when we're talking about energy consumption, we may very well be talking about water withdrawals and consumption. You may be thinking, well, what if we just build a whole bunch of solar panels? What if we build a whole bunch of wind turbines, and then we use those sources of energy to power all of this AI technology? That would be great, except the problem is wind and solar are intermittent sources of electricity, meaning that you can't generate solar energy at night because the sun is down, and the wind doesn't always blow. And so you have these kinds of peaks and valleys in the energy production. If you're serving a population of people, solar is a pretty good way to go, because you need the most energy during the day. When people are awake, that's when you need your heating and cooling. Typically, when people go to bed, right? That energy demand goes down into a valley along with the supply. But these AI data centers generally are running 24/7. So the kind of baseline demand on the energy grid goes up. And that means that thermoelectric sources of electricity are more desirable for the people who are building data centers. And so that is why you get headlines like, this is another one from MIT Technology Review, AI could keep us dependent on natural gas for decades to come, right? So these data centers don't want these intermittent power sources. They want the fossil fuels or nuclear in some cases. Now, again, we're talking about data centers broadly speaking. And so you may say, well, there are lots more uses for data centers that aren't generative AI, that aren't the large language models, and so on. And that's true. So it's a bit difficult to really piece out how much of AI, what proportion of the energy demand is coming from AI, though, because AI companies favor these hyperscale data centers, they're building these new expansive data centers rather than kind of building up on the existing infrastructure. And so you start to see a bit more of the local impacts from these brand new data centers. But it is true that data center demand is growing, and AI represents one part of that. And I want to be clear. I'm not trying to mislead anybody. I want to be clear about that. But here's the thing. MIT Technology Review reported from 2005 to 2017, the amount of electricity going to data centers remained quite flat, thanks to increases in efficiency, despite the construction of armies of new data centers to serve the rise of cloud-based online services. In 2017, AI began to change everything. Data centers started getting built with energy-intensive hardware designed for AI, which led them to double their electricity consumption by 2023. So let's talk about scale. So what we do know about generative AI is that about 10 to 20%, and this is rough estimates, about 10 to 20% of the overall energy and water consumption goes to the training phase, right? So before you have a product, you have to train a large language model or image or video generation technologies on these large corpuses, corpora, I don't know, corpuses of text and image and video. That's the training phase. 80 to 90% of energy consumption comes from what they call the inference phase. And that is when you go to the website and you start talking to the chat bot or whatever, and they serve up a custom result for what it is that you are asking for. Okay, so it's difficult to see how that sort of technology is going to scale in a way that's efficient. So I'm going to use an analogy here. Let's say you were building a multiplex theater. You have 10 screens, 100 seats in each. So you put a lot of investment. There's a lot of resources that go into the building of your multiplex. In terms of efficiency, so if one person is in each of those screenings, or if 100 people are in each of those screenings, your overhead most of your costs are overhead, right? So most of your costs go into the building of the building, putting in the seats and everything, paying the licensing to show the movies or whatever. A lot of that is overhead. So whether you have one person in each showing or whether you have 100 people in each showing, your costs are basically the same. So the more people that come to the movies, the lower the cost per person is, right? So you achieve more efficiency with more people coming to the theater in a certain sense, right? So a very basic static website is kind of like that. You put all of the resources into building the website and serving it up to people's browsers. And so the more people come to visit your website within a certain capacity, the more efficient it is to serve up that website to, however many people, right? Most of the resources go into building that site and building out that infrastructure. And then the more people that use it, the lower the relative cost is, right? That's what we're talking about when we say, efficiency. Now, this is not a great example, really, but imagine a food truck that serves up really high-end steak. So by comparison, your overhead costs are relatively low. You just gotta you buy the food truck, right? And then you have to staff it. But then every person who comes and orders your super high-end steak, let's say you're providing $10 worth of steak for everybody who comes to the food truck. So the more people come to the food truck, the more your costs go up because you're supplying something that is very valuable for every person who comes to the truck. So that's kind of what we're getting with these generative AI services, is you're putting a lot of computational power into every request for everybody who comes and hits enter, right? So it's hard to see how you're going to achieve efficiencies with that sort of scale. With that food truck example, at a certain point, maybe you can talk to like the wholesaler or something. But again, if it's a premium product, you're not really going to get a whole lot of a discount. You're really not going to achieve much efficiency just by the nature of the thing. And AI is sort of like that. You're serving up so much. You're serving up a really premium product for everybody who comes. And so it's hard to imagine that it's going to become more efficient in the future. Maybe there's going to be some, maybe there's something on the horizon. Who knows? It's not here yet. And so we don't really know what is that path for achieving efficiency, or is this curve of energy demand just going to keep climbing up at a constant rate? That's kind of what it seems like right now. The estimates here, these are experts that are coming up with these estimates. So in 2024, AI used between 53 and 76 terawatt hours of electricity. All data centers used about 200 terawatt hours. This is looking at the US. One study estimated that by 2028, AI alone could account for between 150 and 300 terawatt hours. So AI is really driving a lot of this energy demand through data centers. And potentially, in a few years, it could be AI alone could be using more energy than all of the data center usage from last year. This data center energy demand is so significant that a study revealed that 70% of electricity rate increases in the Mid-Atlantic region came from data center demand. So people's energy bills are already going up because of data center demand. That's data centers in a broad sense, but we know that AI energy usage is really driving the increase in these data centers, partly because it has not achieved that efficiency that older uses of data centers have already achieved. I think another thing too, I kind of want to speak. I think there's been a kind of back and forth with this energy and water footprint of AI, and people have responded. I've seen people respond, suggesting that people are singling out AI for whatever reason. And I think, and like, yeah, I think that's clear. This is happening as part of a larger conversation about generative AI and its social impacts, and whether it's good for people's mental health, whether it's good for a plagiarism machine to be doing people's homework. There's a whole host of concerns about this, and the ecological concern is one part of that larger conversation. I don't think we need to be coy about that. That's what's happening. But I think also people have pointed to these other uses of technology, of data centers. And one difference, I just want to point this out, one difference is it's clear that people who are watching Netflix are very much doing so voluntarily. They're, people who are on video calls or whatever, there's a very clear use case for why people are doing that. Whereas some of these, AI search features or summarize your email or whatever, this is all showing up in all of this other technology that we already use without people having asked for it. And so a lot of people are wanting to turn this stuff off. It's not at all clear that there's any kind of organic demand for this use of data centers. And I say that while also acknowledging, yeah, absolutely. Let's look at the energy footprint. Let's look at the water footprint of streaming or whatever, or video calls or whatever. And while I'm on the topic, so when I was talking about semiconductor fabrications, the Biden administration promoted, touted its CHIPS Act, which was meant to promote semiconductor fabrication in the U.S. as a way to, not have the country's tech sector be so dependent on semiconductors in China. China is very good at fabricating semiconductors, and so there's this initiative to spur on the industry in the U.S. and it's supposed to create jobs and everything. Well, the CHIPS Act, as I understand it, is kind of in limbo now with the Trump administration, but to this point that people are there's a kind of there's a bit of partisanship in how people are responding to AI, it seems like. And the CHIPS Act did not get the same scrutiny in terms of its water consumption. And some of those semiconductor fabrications have been popping up here in the West, where we don't have the water to be creating semiconductors. And I wish we would, I feel like I'm being consistent here. I wish we would pay more attention to the CHIPS Act and be more critical of that sort of a thing, because that is also using water that in the West here is precious. We don't have an abundance of that sort of, we don't have a lot of water for that sort of use. I don't care if it creates jobs or whatever. We got to be smarter about this sort of thing. Now, speaking of the impacts in the West. So here's the thing. If you're asking, do we have enough water for AI data centers in the U.S. West? I don't have to know anything about AI's energy or water consumption to say, no, we don't. Because the thing is we don't have enough water for existing uses here in the West to be used sustainably. And that's been, this conversation has been happening very intensely for the last 3 years. And to some extent, it's been happening for decades. This is something that people have been thinking about going back to the 1970s in some cases. We have to figure out what we're going to do with existing water supplies here in the West. People will point out, agriculture uses much more water, and that's absolutely true. No use of water is going to come anywhere near what agriculture consumes. But that's not a solution. You can't just point to that and say, oh, well, let's just take water from agriculture. We've been this conversation has been happening for at least a few years, and more accurately, it's been happening for decades. And there's no easy way to get water out of agriculture to be used for urban, municipal, and industrial usage while also cutting the overall rate of water consumption. So water supply is going down. We need to take all of the existing water consumption and cut across the board to be able to be sustainable within the amount of water that we're going to have in 10 years and 20 years. So the analogy I would make here, you're in a crowded elevator, and the elevator is probably overloaded, and so you're not going anywhere. You're stuck. You're having a conversation about whether somebody needs to get off. In the middle of that conversation, it's getting heated. In the middle of that conversation, someone else walks up to the elevator and wants to get on. It doesn't matter how big or small that person is. Like, you're not getting on the elevator. We've been having this conversation. You just introduced a new layer of complexity, and we can't deal with it. So you got to go away. That's kind of how I feel about any new use of water in the West. There's not enough water for this. And yet, reporting shows that a lot of these data centers are going in the West. So why is that? So one reason, I think probably maybe the larger reason is the same reason why a bunch of people and a bunch of businesses move to the West. They're continuing to flood into the region. It's cheaper. It's cheap land. And also, if you're a business, there's fewer regulations. There are fewer labor unions. It's a lot of the states like Utah or Idaho, Arizona to some extent, right? They promote themselves to businesses as business-friendly states. Lower taxes, lower regulations, and so a lot of people, a lot of businesses are being actively attracted to the region. When it comes to data centers, there's also there's some physical characteristics. The air is very dry, and it also cools off considerably overnight in the desert. And so when you're cooling your data center with water, you get more efficiency with cooling with water with dry air. And then when the temps drop overnight, as they do in the desert, that's a bit more efficient for running your operation. You don't necessarily need to cool data centers with water, but that's more common. There's a data center here that cools just with air. It doesn't use water. I don't know what their electricity usage is. I'm just throwing that out there. So here's a map from reporting from Stanford University. And these are the hot spots for data centers around the country. And you can see that, some of these places in the West, where there's not a lot of water, that's where the data centers are popping up. Arizona is notable, Salt Lake City area, metro area. But also around the country. Bloomberg News found that about 2/3 of new data centers built or in development since 2022 are in places already gripped by high levels of water stress. It's not just the West that is susceptible to water stress. And when we talk about water stress, then you're pulling in other considerations rather than the overall rate of consumption. But some places are municipal supplies are being taxed by the water demands of these data centers. This is already happening. There was a New York Times article recently that looked at Newton County in Georgia, not far from Atlanta. So there's two distinct things happening in the article, and the article kind of jams them together in talking about water. But one thing is the hook here is there's a family, and they use a well for their domestic water source, and their well has been considerably polluted with sediment caused by the construction of a data center nearby that's torn down a bunch of forest. That creates a lot of loose soil that gets that erodes a lot faster than in a forest, and that ended up in their well. And so their well had all the sediment, so water quality was impacted for them. But there's another issue happening here. The Times interviewed the county's water manager, and he said there's not enough water to supply all the applications they got for data centers. So here's what's happening there is with the data center, with that very expensive investment, you don't just run unfiltered river water through that system that's going to cool, your sophisticated hyperscale GPU server racks. You need treated water. So I looked at Newton County a little bit. It's a fairly small county, about 100,000 people. About a third of residents are considered rural. In like this family, I imagine there's a number of people who use wells for their homes, or if you wouldn't need to irrigate, but if they're irrigating or whatever, you can find a creek or a pond or whatever. There's plenty of those in Georgia, right? What you don't have a lot of is the capacity of these municipal water systems. And so if you're drawing on all of the treated water, well, then you have maybe not an issue of overall consumption, because if it's water that you need, you can find a stream or a river or something or a lake to get water from. But it's a matter of the capacity of these treatment plants in the existing infrastructure that delivers municipal and industrial water that's being strained. And that's, again, this is an expansive view of water. This is not just, how many gallons do we have and how much are we using. That kind of abstract, that like very abstract global measure of water, it's kind of pointless. That doesn't really tell us anything. What we have to do is look at local impacts. And here's the thing. So maybe you're not in the West. Maybe you are in Georgia and you're like, we have plenty of water. Who cares? But here's the thing, though. Pay attention to this stuff. Pay attention to the rate at which these resources are being consumed and the rate at which these resources are being stressed. Because you don't want to be in the situation like we're in the West, where it's the 11th hour and everybody's yelling down each other's throats, trying to sort out a problem that should have been sorted out decades ago. You want to be proactive about this stuff. You want to anticipate problems rather than reacting to them at the point where you're in a crisis. That shouldn't be that hard to understand, right? Here in the West, it's pretty definitive in my view. We don't have water for this stuff. And there's so much money and there's so much power, and it's happening anyway. And, some places are starting to push back against these developments, which I think is a positive development. I think that's encouraging. I think people are right to question this business-friendly logic of, more jobs, we're going to create more jobs. That has not really panned out that well in the past. So the West, the story is clear. And I encourage people who are not in the West, who may not be facing critical levels of water stress at the moment, again, be proactive about this stuff. You don't want to let it fester and become a huge problem. I hope that was instructive. I hope that this helped you understand a little bit more what it is that we know and we don't know about AI and water and energy. And I hope that helps contextualize things and make things a little bit more real. Thanks for watching.